Chapter 2, Blood Rails and Jagged Tongues. The railways stitched the country like sutures over a scar. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, steel cut through soil soaked in memory. The ghouls didn't build the tracks, not directly. But they signed the contracts, approved the labor, owned the lands the trains would pass through. The railroads were sold to the public as progress, a future of movement, of unity, of speed. But for the ghouls, they were arteries, veins of metal along which product and people could be moved, tracked, processed, fed upon without anyone ever seeing where they vanished. Chinese immigrants disappeared first. Not in protests. Not in riots. In silence. Whole work camps found abandoned, tools left behind, no signs of struggle. The officials blamed desertion. The ghouls blamed appetite. And the story rolled on. By 1881, it wasn't just rail. It was industry. Meat packing in Chicago. Coal in West Virginia. Steel in Pennsylvania. Textiles in New England. Each factory, each mill, each mine was a mouth. And each laborer was a temporary tooth. The ghoul administrators never called that, of course ensured a careful balance. Just enough pay to keep the masses hungry. Just enough death to keep them quiet. They introduced safety regulations after incidents. Mandated hours after uprisings. But always, the victims were the same. The unseen. The unwanted. The new. They began to refine the process. Ghoul-run mortuaries offered free burial to the poor if the families didn't mind closed caskets. Hospitals developed new standard forms for declaring natural death in cases where no autopsy was medically necessary. And orphanages became something else entirely. A child without a name. Without a paper trail. That was the cleanest meal of all. In the South, the prisons were built bigger. Reconstruction faded. Jim Crow rose. And the ghouls adjusted. They didn't care about the laws. Only the flow of bodies. And bodies flowed. Chain gangs. Labor farms. Black men sentenced for loitering, for vagrancy, for looking a white man in the eye. Worked to death and never counted in any census. Some prison camps reported losses so high the math stopped making sense. The guards said escape. The state said turnover. But the fields said nothing. Only the ground remembered. By the 1890s, the ghouls had learned to play the markets. They funded insurance companies that never paid out on deaths they caused. They bought up rail lines, morgues, and fire departments in the same cities. Control the chaos, control the cleanup. Every disaster became a meal. The Johnstown flood. The one that swept away over 2,000. Only half those people died from water. The rest never even got wet. And still, no one noticed. because the ghouls had done what even history hadn't expected. They had become the infrastructure. And once your prey builds the roads for you, digs the graves for you, and signs the papers with their own blood, you no longer need to hunt. You just need to govern. Ellis Island opened its doors in 1892. Angel Island followed in 1910. To the hopeful, they were gateways. To the desperate, lifelines. But to the ghouls, they were menus. 2 coasts. 2 ports. 2 stories. But the same machine. Ellis Island was the theater. The grand stage. Clean marble. Flags. Brass bands welcoming tired feet and tired hearts from Europe. Immigrants passed beneath the watchful eyes of federal clerks, doctors, guards. Some human. Many not. At night, beneath the inspection halls, cold rooms held the unfit, the sick, the unclaimed. Some were deported. Some were lost in processing. And some, just a few, just enough to keep the numbers balanced, never left. The records were altered. A typo. A mix-up in spelling. A man named Miklos became Michael until there was no Miklos to ask. A baby died of fever, said the form. But there was no grave. Angel Island, on the Pacific, was worse. It wasn't a gateway. It was a filter. Chinese immigrants were held for weeks, months, even years, trapped in detention under the guise of processing. There was no oversight. No visibility. And ghouls love silence. In those cold barracks, prisoners disappeared in ones and twos. Their families told they'd been denied. That they'd returned home. That there had been an outbreak. But there were no outbreaks. Just feasts. Some detainees whispered of watchers who never slept. Of men in uniforms whose teeth weren't quite right. Of footsteps at night that never matched the number of beds in the room. The government made the ghouls part of the system. Every intake. Every death. Every human being reduced to a name on a ledger, then shuffled into the chutes of history. Some were released. Some were shipped inland. And some were processed. The immigrants had fled famine, war, persecution. They came seeking a new world. And they found one, they just didn't know it wore a face beneath the face. Then came World War I. And with it, opportunity. The draft flooded the streets with marching meat. Young men. Strong. Scared. Ready to die for something. Ghouls embedded in recruitment offices saw the lists first. They circled names. Flagged disappearances as desertions. Redirected certain transports. Some troops never even made it overseas. One entire battalion, the 312th, was loaded onto a ship that never docked in France. It sank, they said. But no wreckage was ever found. and the paperwork was signed by an officer whose signature matched another name from the Civil War. But the real feast was in Europe. Ghouls joined the war effort as medics, quartermasters, handlers of the dead. No one asked where the bodies went after artillery strikes. No one questioned why certain trenches were found empty, yet no Germans had advanced. And when soldiers returned home, broken in mind and body, some weren't themselves. Some weren't even human anymore. But they wore the uniform. And that was enough. Back in the States, post-war chaos helped the ghouls even more. The Spanish flu buried bodies faster than churches could count them. Some never got buried. Some weren't dead yet. The Red Scare gave the government new tools to silence voices. And the ghouls knew exactly how to use them. And the returning veterans. Many had seen things. But none of them wanted to talk. Because who would believe that the man in your foxhole didn't breathe? That he smiled when the gas came? By 1920, America was proud, wounded, and haunted. But no one called it that. They called it a new age. A century of industry. Of innovation. But underneath the jazz and the gears, the ghouls smiled. Because Ellis Island still processed names. Angel Island still filtered flesh. And the world was marching toward another war. Another feast. However, things were getting much worse. For all the progress made, no one could stop the depression that was coming. By 1931, America was gaunt. Faces sunk in like fruit left too long in the sun. Bread lines stretched down the block. Men stood in suits they'd once worn to church, now trading labor for crumbs. Children stared into soup pots and hoped they wouldn't wake up hungry again. And the ghouls? They watched from the cracks. Not in panic. In calculation. Because they'd prepared for famine before. They'd endured plagues. But this was mass starvation on a scale they couldn't feed on. A body that starves too long becomes worthless. Bone too brittle. Organs shriveled. Blood too thin to hold heat, let alone flavor. And while the nation wept and rationed, the ghouls looked down at their warehouses. The numbers were staggering. Stored in meat lockers under defunct hospitals. Packed into morgues that had no public record. Buried under sanitation zones in the Midwest, tagged and filed. Millions of tons of processed human remains. Labeled as disease research. Wartime backlog. Some were clean. Some were salted. Some had never been registered as dead at all. And to the ghouls, it was gold rotting in the vault. So they made a move. Not public. Not loud. But precise. They started with one company. A nutritional supplement provider rebranded in a Brooklyn warehouse. Then a second, in Chicago, producing protein biscuits for orphanages. By 1933, 15 companies were quietly under Ghoul management. producing flour, canned stews, meat pastes. All tested, all approved, all just a little different. The trick was the ratio. Never more than 3 to 5%. Just enough to stretch, to stabilize, to keep humans fed, and just human enough to not notice. Because it wasn't about turning them into ghouls. It was about preserving the herd. Keeping meat on the bones. Keeping skin smooth. Keeping taste intact. The products were cheap. Half the price of brand names. Delivered fast. Wrapped in patriotic paper. Labeled with words like fortified, hunger-busting, American-made. And no one asked what filler protein meant. Because they were too hungry to care. Factories started churning. Warehouses emptied. And the ghouls smiled. They had solved their crisis. They had fed the country to itself. One spoonful at a time. And when people felt stronger, when the body bounced back, the ghouls took note, watched carefully, filed health reports that were never submitted to the Surgeon General. They learned exactly what kind of blend made the best recovery, which cuts preserved cognition, which organs lent stamina to children. They weren't just feeding now. They were refining. Crafting a new generation of Americans who had no idea their survival came from the marrow of the last one. And still no one asked questions. Because the stomach doesn't care where the meal came from. Not when it's finally full. In 1934, under the guise of Roosevelt's Rapid Industrial Recovery Plan, the government sanctioned the creation of 48 companies, one per mainland state. Publicly, they were food cooperatives, nutritional experimenters, and emergency suppliers tasked with feeding a starving nation. Privately, they were managed by ghouls handpicked from pre-existing families with deep roots, deeper appetites, and the ability to blend in. The selection process was whispered, sealed behind state house doors and clinic basements. There were no debates, no announcements. Just names inked onto forms that never entered federal archives. In Georgia, the Bramford family received the contract. Plantation ghosts in modern suits, known for their exceptional knowledge of livestock. In Illinois, the Myrles, originally from Alsace, fluent in French, blood typing, and waste management. In Texas, the Ramos Draytons, mixed heritage, old cattlemen with a long history of butchery for public good. In Maine, the Whispers, a coastal clan who rarely spoke and owned half the state's fish-packing infrastructure. In Oregon, the Doll Crows, fur traders turned cannery tycoons, said to always have cold hands even in summer. In Louisiana, the DeMarcus, known in the parish for making gumbo that tasted like nothing else. And in Pennsylvania, the paperwork simply read, Eshelman and Sons, Lancaster County. No notes. No prior record of public office. No scandals. Just a signature from someone whose last name had been erased from birth. Most never noticed. Just another family. Just another rural outfit with old barns and well-fenced land. They started small canned goods, preserved meats, something about Amish-grade sourcing. The locals trusted them. Their storefront was quiet. Their trucks ran on time. But the name lingers. The Eshelmans. Somewhere in the folds of paper and memory, in a future not yet written, that name will mean more. But for now, just a family. Just another cog in the great American machine. Feeding the country. One jar at a time. But as America stabilized, the world outside became hell wrapped in opportunity. The morning after Pearl Harbor, the American people wept. The papers ran in black. Flags dropped to half-mast. And in the basements of federal buildings beneath D.C., ghouls lit cigars with maps. Opportunity. That's all it ever was. Not just war. Not just retribution. But the kind of global fracture they'd been waiting for since the last war sputtered out. Because war meant chaos. And chaos meant fluid borders, mass migration, undefended bodies, and radicalized minds. Perfect ingredients for a second phase of global expansion. Japan, for instance, had always treated its own ghoul population like a cursed lineage. The old bloodlines were buried under folklore, Oni, Kijo, Kyuden. But they were real. And they were starving. The Japanese Empire had driven its native ghouls underground, fearing them, hating them, occasionally recruiting them but never feeding them. And now, with the homeland strained under blockade and fire, Tokyo had no eyes for the underworld. So the Americans slipped in quiet. Via black market supply lines, routed through abandoned islands and diplomatic intermediaries, they made contact. Not with the government, but with the monsters buried beneath it. And they delivered crates. Not weapons. Protein. Labeled in kanji that didn't exist. Sealed in wax that couldn't be traced. The message was clear. Let your masters fight the Americans. We'll feed you while you burn them down from within. Spain was soft. Still licking its wounds from civil war. No allies. No protection. Just a husk of Catholic nationalism stretched over a fractured people. Perfect. The ghouls tested a new program there, institutional inversion. They replaced entire orphanage staffs with agents. Opened relief hospitals in Barcelona where no one ever left. Funneled shipments through neutral ports and tested how long it would take a small country to lose track of its own dead. Answer: 6 months. The Spanish never noticed. Too poor to ask questions. Too proud to admit answers. And Germany. No one would ask questions in Germany. The Nazis had dehumanized millions. Had created a system where names meant nothing. where numbers were sewn onto skin and men became statistics. The ghouls didn't support the Reich. They didn't need to, because the Reich had already built their dream infrastructure. Camps, transport, disappearing bodies. A globe so consumed with evil that one more missing train meant nothing. And when the Reich began to fall, the Americans were there. Ghouls embedded in the liberating forces, walking through camps not to save but to select. They pulled from both sides, war criminals and survivors. Anyone who could disappear into American records and never be seen again. Some became scientists under Operation Paperclip. Some became patients. Some became resources. And when asked about the stench in certain abandoned villages, certain cellars beneath the Alps, the Americans just said, "War crimes. Nothing more." And the world believed them. Because who would dare ask if America was also feeding? The ghouls never let another Great Depression happen. Not because they solved economics. Because they'd learned to farm globally. And this World War was just the next great harvest. And by the time the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it wasn't just America that stood as the only superpower. It was the ghouls inside it, feeding from beneath the stars and stripes, smiling while the world bled for the last time without their permission. By 1947, when the real world braced for nuclear tension, espionage, and ideological proxy wars, this world didn't blink. There was no Cold War. There was no need. Because the earth was already spoken for. Not by flags. Not by ideologies. But by ghouls. The victors of World War II weren't democracies. They were structures, fed by systems that no longer needed justification, only maintenance. America stood tall, but not just because of its military. It stood tall because every rival knew what ran beneath it. Russia saw it. Not just Stalin, everyone in power. The KGB didn't just intercept messages. They intercepted cargo manifests from Ellis Island. They studied anomalies in prisoner disappearances during the siege of Leningrad. They uncovered testimonies from Nazi defectors who spoke of American soldiers that didn't bleed right. They knew. And they made the only sane decision. Don't poke the myth. They fortified. Turned inward. Let America play emperor, and chose to be the walled graveyard that fed itself slowly, quietly. Russian ghouls, older, nastier, often feral, were isolated, unstable. But they understood one truth. You don't provoke the ones who learned to farm humans like cattle and made them write songs about it. There was no Berlin blockade. No Cuban Missile Crisis. No red phone in the White House. No starved children in bomb drills under desks. Instead, there were summits with no transcripts. Night flights between Moscow and DC that never showed up on radar. Rooms with no windows where no interpreter ever left alive. They didn't negotiate with treaties. They traded bodies. Information, sometimes. But mostly, meat quotas. In China, the party watched closely. In India, certain villages were moved without ever being accounted for. In Africa, entire governments were lifted, emptied, and replaced by smiling men with cold pulses. And across the globe, humanity cheered the Pax Americana. The long peace. The boom years. The spread of capitalism. The miracles of medicine. Never knowing that behind every headline, every policy shift, every sudden breakthrough, the ghouls were managing the population. Efficiently. Quietly. Lovingly, even. Because when you run the world, you don't need war. You just need supply. And so the earth turned. Not in conflict, but in careful, regulated hunger. And the stars looked down at a planet unified not by peace, but by what feeds in silence. By the early 1950s, the illusion was perfected. The suburbs were blooming. Children smiled on cereal boxes. Presidents gave speeches about destiny, freedom, and exceptionalism. But underneath the chrome and color TV, beneath the picket fences and Tupperware parties, the feed system thrived. Every country had been slotted into a role. America, the epicenter, the mouth of the earth. The rest of the world, teeth, tongue, throat, all digesting, all swallowing, all contributing to the ongoing meal of civilization. The UN was a buffet table dressed in diplomacy. Votes were counted, alliances declared. But behind every peacekeeping effort was a side contract. A trade. A shipment. An unexplained military action that resulted in cultural displacement and a surplus of unaccounted bodies. UNICEF began its greatest growth phase. And who better to manage child welfare logistics than ghoul-blooded NGOs who knew how to move warm cargo across seas without ever filing a customs form? By 1956, human culture became self-sustaining camouflage. TV normalized vanishing. She ran away. He was drafted. They moved to Chicago. Missing persons reports surged, but none were investigated. Why would they be? The economy was strong. Growth was consistent. Bodies were replaced faster than they vanished. And in every city, new companies rose: nutritional research, hunger relief, low-cost food technology. Many were fronts. Some were not. But all of them played their part. In 1963, JFK was shot. And for the first time in decades, the ghouls panicked. Not because he knew. He didn't. But because he was about to. Kennedy had begun asking questions about post-war shipping manifests from Europe. About the increase in rural disappearances in counties no longer on the census. About a Department of Agriculture program called Project Cleanstock, a name no one could define, but which had $400 million of black budget attached. He never found out what it was. But he got close enough to hear it breathe. So he was removed. And the machine didn't even flinch. Because presidents, like nations, like wars, are ingredients. In the 1970s, with civil unrest rising, the ghouls adjusted the recipe. They let scandal come. Let Vietnam burn. Let Nixon fall. Let the people feel like they still mattered. And as the country mourned its innocence, wondering how far it had fallen, the Eshelmans expanded their operations quietly into 3 more states. No one noticed. Not really. Because what mattered wasn't control. It was narrative saturation. Once a population accepts that bad things just happen, that some disappearances are random, that some wars are necessary, that some truths are too complicated to pursue, you never need to hide again. You just need to keep feeding. Keep soothing. Keep smiling. And if someone gets too close to the truth, well, you feed them something that makes them forget. Or you feed on them. And the world keeps turning. By the 1980s, the world had entered its most brightly lit decade of darkness. The Cold War was theater. Warsaw and Washington traded barbs on air, but behind the curtain, meat moved east to west like breath between lungs. Every famine in Africa was balanced with a medical breakthrough in the States. Every civil war was offset by a Nobel Prize for peace. Balance, always. As long as the system was fed. The corporations exploded. Reaganomics fed the rich, but the ghouls had already eaten the foundation. McDonald Foods, Silver Grain International, Amtech nutritional conglomerates that didn't exist in the real world, but did in the books that no one could audit. These weren't just food companies. They were supply regulators. They monitored consumption trends, calibrated what parts of the population could afford to go missing, adjusted packaging, delivery, advertising, even taste. One of them, based in upstate New York, quietly began testing new products in school lunch programs. Synthetic proteins, they said. Plant-based. Revolutionary. In truth, it was pulverized marrow mixed with hormone-treated soy. Test results. Children in trial regions exhibited faster growth, sharper aggression, and a higher resistance to common illnesses. Parents praised the program. The USDA gave it a pilot name, Fortibrite. It rolled out in 12 states. And the Eshelmans were among the first to license the formula. By the late 80s, the internet was being born. A dream of connection. A tool of knowledge. The ghouls saw it instantly for what it was. A new way to herd the flock. Not through wires, but through thought. No longer did they have to rely solely on vanishing people physically. They could now discredit, drown, or digitally erase. If someone discovered too much, a blog with 22 followers, A late-night college forum. A conspiracy zine no one archived. Gone. Buried in noise. No murder. No trace. Just forgotten. And beneath all of it, the Eshelmans stayed quiet. Lancaster's proudest producers. Old world. Simple. No television ads. No scandals. But their trucks moved day and night. They were one of only 3 families trusted with civilian experimentation authorization, a term that didn't exist on paper, but everyone in the loop understood. When new formulas needed testing. When warehouse surpluses needed to vanish. When low-yield flesh needed recycling. The Eshelmans took care of it. Not loudly. Just effectively. And when a small-town mayor in Pennsylvania started asking questions about why the deer population had vanished, why the soil around Eshelman property wouldn't grow tomatoes, and why kids from the local church kept going missing on camping trips, he shot himself. With a gun that was later found to have no prints. And a suicide note typed in Courier. On a typewriter no one in his office owned. By 1990, the ghouls didn't just run Earth. They ran expectation. No one believed in monsters anymore. And the ones who did, they were laughed off stage. Turned into punchlines. Or hired by the ghouls to write horror fiction that barely scratched the surface. Because the best way to hide a horror is to make it entertainment. And the feast continued. A little more refined. A little more subtle. But always hungry. Because what feeds in silence now writes the script itself.